and welcome to the fourth and final of our Edinburgh Fringe preview podcasts for this year. In a moment, you'll hear me talking about a play on words and Three Times I Killed. But first, I spoke to writer and performer Andy Dickinson about the tale of the original Jekyll and Hyde. And I'm joined now by writer and performer Andy Dickinson to hear all about his show, The Tale of the Original Jekyll and Hyde. Hello, Andy.
Hello, Alistair. How are we doing?
Really well, thanks. Really
Yeah.
well. Now, the original Jekyll and Hyde is the key here. Tell us about the show.
The original Jekyll and Hyde is Deacon Brodie, who is a very known local character in Edinburgh, which is where I live now. If you were to do a tour of the Royal Mile, I think the three kind of stories you're most likely to hear is about Deacon Brodie. There's a pub called Deacon Brodie on the Royal Mile. There's a cafe there as well. There is a chest which he built. He was a very respected kind of cabinet maker in the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh. The other two would be Burke and Hare and probably Greyfriars Bobby. Now, I don't know about Greyfriars Bobby and Burke and Hare, what the tour guides do, but I have a reasonable idea what they do about Deacon Brodie is they'll talk about him for 2-3 minutes and they'll basically mention his being an inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson and Jekyll and Hyde, and they'll tell a little bit about the burglaries on the Royal Mile. And then there was a trial and there was a hanging, which is not a great secret. So in terms of my show, the excitement's, how we get there rather than the actual ultimate kind of denouement, so to speak. And I tell it in far more detail, so you get 55 minutes. And I think a lot of people in Edinburgh, they know the story, but you don't really know the story unless you read the biographies and so on.
Yeah, there's a kind of recognition of the name. There's a recognition of the pub because it's a lovely pub.
It is
But,
a lovely book.
but I think you're right. A lot of people won't know much more than the kind of initial story. But before we get into that, we should tell people where and when they can see the show in
Yeah,
Edinburgh.
so I mean, I'm going to be in Riddles Court, which is a Greenside venue. That is just off the Royal Mile. I haven't actually done a show exactly on the Royal Mile before. I've always been just slightly off the Royal Mile because this is like my sixth Fringe now.
Right.
But I just felt it was really important for this particular show because it is quite a kind of dark Edinburgh show that I wanted it to, have that kind of atmosphere around it in terms of the old buildings and so on, and the narrow alleyways and just to be off the Royal Mile. And it's probably about, 25 meters from Deacon Brodie's workshop, which is the cafe these days. So it is right in the heart of his stomping ground, which I think will help with the kind of the ambience of the piece as well. And we're on for 3 weeks. We're doing the full run.
Yeah.
Effectively from like the 7th of August through to the 29th. And I've got a couple of Sundays off, which we all need through a long run. So but apart from that, straight through.
It sounds like if people are looking for an Edinburgh specific show in all sorts of ways, you couldn't get much more so than this. And that's more rare than people might think in the Fringe.
Well, it is. I mean, I was amazed because I did a show about Tam O'Shanter and Robbie Burns in the past. You probably noticed from my accent that I'm originally from Manchester, and I'm specifically from Stockport. And that is the title of the show, The Tale of the Original Jekyll and Hyde, told by a Mad Hatter from Stockport. So partly explains the bucket hat. This is my kind of show hat. I don't walk around with a black bucket hat on all the time. And particularly not when, the weather is as warm as it is now. I've been living in Edinburgh for 8 years now, and I absolutely love being in Edinburgh. I love the city. I love, the Fringe. I love all the cultural aspects to it and so on and so forth. I like all the stories you hear on the old town. I like the kind of dark Edinburgh kind of feel and so on. And I thought, well, I would really like to do an Edinburgh show because it's like my little kind of poem to Edinburgh in some respects. It's a celebration of Edinburgh, and it's a celebration in some respects of the most exciting period in Edinburgh's history, which is the time of the Enlightenment, which is what Jekyll and Hyde's all about. It's all about light and dark. Lots of seedy things were happening in the old town in that period. Whilst, we had the Scottish Enlightenment going on. We had Robbie Burns and Deacon Brodie walking the Royal Mile at the same time. There's no evidence they actually met each other, but they probably passed each other on the street. And that's, very exciting. So I thought I'll do an Edinburgh story. I got really quite interested in this one during the pandemic. Um, and as a good producer as well as a writer and a performer, I looked it up. And there was a musical about Deacon Brodie. It was either last year or 2 years ago.
Okay.
There is a Jekyll and Hyde show for just 1 week this year. And I think there is a Deacon Brodie as well, just for 1 week. Their kind of school's coming in to do the show. But as far as I can see, there's not been a storytelling Deacon Brodie for at least 20 years in the Edinburgh.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, hopefully, um, it will be one that will be welcomed in terms of, people want to hear a good Edinburgh story when they're in Edinburgh.
Now, without giving away any spoilers, can you tell us a bit more about Deacon Brodie?
Yeah, so again, the most famous thing about him is the inspiration for Jekyll and Hyde, and everybody knows Jekyll and Hyde, one character by day, another character by night. Supposed to be the inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson because he lived in Edinburgh. Obviously, he grew up here and he heard the stories about Deacon Brodie. This cabinet, which is in the Writers' Museum, is actually one which is supposed to have been at the foot of Robert Louis Stevenson's bed, like for most of his childhood. So it's kind of a presence in his mind the whole time. And Deacon Brodie, he was a Jekyll and Hyde character, which is kind of anachronistic to say because the Jekyll and Hyde came after. But, by day, he was a very respectable cabinet maker. The time when, to be really at the top of your craft trade made you a very respected member of your community. He was a member of the local council. As a result of that, he was the president of Edinburgh's Incorporation of Wrights and Masons, for instance. He was very well dressed. He was very dapper. He knew all the great and the good. He looked after the great and the good as well in terms of making furniture for them. But he also would make keys for them occasionally. And this is where the key moves him from the darkness, from the light to the darkness. Because at night he was getting up to all sorts. He was a heavy drinker. He was a heavy gambler. Seems to be lots of women and prostitution and so on and so forth. And he had a very expensive lifestyle, and he couldn't pay for it. And because he was going round looking after the houses of the great and the good, he kind of saw an opportunity, started to take key impressions of the houses of some of these people, and he would return weeks or months later and basically go and rob them. And initially, he wasn't very good at it either, which is quite amusing in terms of how the show starts, because he probably got recognised about 2 or 3 times. He got caught in the act, and the people who saw him, they thought, "My God, that's Deacon Brodie," but they literally couldn't believe their own eyes. So he kind of got away with it, and things settled down for a bit, and then he started again a few years later. So he did some early crimes where he nearly got caught. He inherited some money off his father, which settled him down for a few years. And then his real kind of crime spree was sort of 1786 through to early 1788. And they're not sure exactly which ones, you can definitively attribute to Deacon Brodie. But, you're looking at 10, 15 crimes over that period, and it become quite a sensation because it was, someone was opening locks and nobody's seen anything, nobody's hearing anything, just these rumours going around about a masked man being on the loose, and potentially a gang of them, because as things he did start to recruit some people as well. So, yeah.
So what can audiences expect when they come along to the show?
Well, as I say, it's the story is told by a Mad Hatter from Stockport, so that's me. And as my alter ego, Stanley, people in Stockport, they were Mad Hatters because of the hatting industry back there, kind of 18th, 19th century.
Is the Hatters the nickname of the football team?
It is the nickname of the football team, yeah.
There you go.
And it's where you kind of get the idea for the Mad Hatters Tea Party from as well. And it was the mercury used in the felting, which made people mad, effectively. So that's kind of the device of the Mad Hatter, which is my alter ego, Stanley, that he takes sniffs of mercury and then he's gone a bit mad. And he can basically enter any historical situation. So it's a bit like, I don't know, Harry Potter, you get on the steam train, you go to Hogwarts, the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, you go through the wardrobe into another world. My character sniffs his mercury and he's off and away. So a couple of years ago, he was with Napoleon, 100 days. marching from Elba up to Paris and was there at the Battle of Waterloo. He was Napoleon's sidekick. Last year, he went up Everest with Mallory and Irvine, who maybe climbed Everest for the first time in 1924, 29 years before Edmund Hillary. Probably not, but they could have done. So Stanley was there. It would have been a bit much for Stanley to get right to the top, but he got fairly high. He got fairly high. And then in this case, he turns up in Edinburgh in the 1780s because he likes his whiskey. And because he's having a few whiskies, and this is a little detail I'm not going to give out just at the moment, but he gets caught in a little misdemeanor himself. So Stanley has a little bit of a moment of light and dark, and he gets caught by Deacon Brodie. So Deacon Brodie blackmails him, and he blackmails him into becoming his lookout. So you're seeing it through the eyes of a fictional character who's on the scene for all the crimes as the lookout, effectively. And he's kind of got one foot in and one kind of foot out, which again is a bit kind of the light and dark. And hopefully it's told with a lot of humour in terms of the capers and the antics of Deacon and how Stanley's being dragged along against his will and thinking the whole thing's madness, but he's caught up in it, and what can he do? He's kind of having to go along with it, and it's obviously spirals and spirals and spirals in terms of how serious this is,
Yeah.
and how serious it could be as well.
It sounds as though there's a touch of Jekyll and Hyde about Stanley as well, buzzing away in his Mercury.
Well, yes. I mean, the Mercury, you could also, say that's moving between worlds, I guess, in a way. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you mentioned Robbie Burns, and you've adapted Tam O'Shanter in the past.
Yeah.
And you tell us a little bit about that, because that sounds interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's again because I'm very happy living in Edinburgh. I think it's a wonderful city, and it was a lockdown project, and it was something that I was looking at in terms of because I work as a tour guide. So by day I'm a tour guide, by night I'm a performer. So I'm a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde,
Yes.
I guess, in some respects. And I was surprised to see nobody's doing anything about Burns. Obviously, the national poet of Scotland. Nobody seems to do anything about him in terms of, obviously Burns night occasions and so on, but there's nothing like a regular fixture for tourists. There's no Burns walking tour that I could find back in the day. And I just thought it's such a...
Do you mean in Edinburgh, or do you mean more generally in Scotland?
No, specifically in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
It's where he became famous.
Yeah.
Obviously, Ayr and Alloway and all the rest of it. But nothing at all. And I started to think, well, actually, I'll have a look at Burns. And I studied English literature at university and so on. But I didn't read Burns because I was doing English literature. But when it came to Scotland, obviously I wanted to read Scottish literature. But I never got round to Burns till the pandemic came. And I couldn't believe how amazing, the poetry is of Robbie Burns. Imagine not having read him all your life and suddenly, opening up something like Death and Dr. Hornbook.
Yeah.
And you're just completely blown away. What an incredible poet, what incredible use of language, what great versatility in terms of, he could write love poems, he could write political poems, he could write comic poems. He was an inspiration for the Romantics. He obviously wrote about nature and so on and so forth. And it completely blew me away. I thought, wow, why have I not been reading Burns all my life? And I think part of the reason is there is a little bit of a barrier because obviously, he wrote lots of his poems in Scots.
Yeah.
But as soon as you get through that, and you can understand most of it contextually, and the fact he writes in Scots is just a celebration of language, which is what, of course, poets do. I was just like, wow, I'd really like to do something with this. But it was kind of back to the Dark Edinburgh thing because I thought, well, that's, a really nice kind of angle to kind of come in to kind of, attract audiences, I suppose, really. And the Tam O'Shanter was the obvious one because it's kind of a Gothic poem comic kind of masterpiece, full of dark atmosphere, but, quiet humour and just some of the most famous lines in world literature within that. And we did Death and Dr. Hornbook, and we did also Address to a Deal. So we did these kind of three kind of dark Edinburgh or kind of Gothic-y poems inspired by Scottish folklore and so on. So it became Tam O'Shanter Tales and Whiskey. We threw in a few Scottish folk tales to complement the folk tales in Robbie Burns. And then we got fantastic performers called the Court of Equity to play some Burns songs for us on the stage. So we had some We had some poems, we had some tales, and we had some music as well. And it went pretty well. We ended up playing the Trav for 2 nights on Burns back in 2023, and we sold out both performances. So
Brilliant.
Not bad for a man from England coming up and having a big success in Edinburgh with the Rabbie Burns.
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. And going back to this year's show, of course, I mean, Edinburgh is the perfect city to look back. Because a lot of cities, their old towns have just been flattened. Whereas Edinburgh's extra, the streets that Deacon Brodie walked, they are still there. The places that he would have hidden on his kind of nighttime assignments are still there. So you really get that atmosphere.
You do, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there is, potential for doing a bit of a spin-off on this and actually taking people around and walking them through the sites. I think that kind of thing would work better in the winter, though. I mean, you want the streets to be dark to be able to really, really experience that. But that's what we can recreate in the theatre, of course. We can recreate that dark atmosphere, and that's what we're going to do.
So, I'm always interested to talk to people who live in Edinburgh all year round, what they are looking forward to at the Fringe. I mean, it sounds like you really love the Fringe time. Not everyone does,
I know.
There all year, but what are you looking forward to particularly at the Fringe?
So for me, it's been fantastic. I used to work as a kind of producer and writer down in London, and I never did the Fringe, although I did stuff in theatre for sort of 7-8 years before I moved to Edinburgh, and it's because of the famous cost of it.
Yeah.
So even with a team of just 4 or 5 people, if you're looking for accommodation,
you're
already £6,000-7,000 in before you've even spent money on the production itself. So when I got the opportunity to come and work up here as a guide, I was like, well, great, because I can do the Fringe whenever I want, because I'm £6,000-7,000 ahead, because I live here. And anybody who's working on the show with me, I've always got a fantastic sound designer called Dominic Brennan. I've got a brilliant American director this year called Ricky Dodola. They can come and stay with me. So brilliant. I think it's wonderful. It's the biggest arts festival in the world. When you're performing, in some respects, you don't get to enjoy it that much because you're doing 3 weeks, and the first 2 weeks, you're still kind of fighting fires. I mean, a show is still developing, it's still live. There's always things to tweak, there's things to change. You have to worry about the marketing, the promotion, the audiences, this, that, and the other. I mean, the first 2 weeks is really just full on dealing with the show. And it's normally week 3 that I can actually take a bit of a breath and say, right, I can actually spend some time now outside my own shows and kind of, see what else is going on. And it's amazing. There was a year, I think 2019, because we'd done a show about Shackleton, which had been really successful. And it'd gone well enough. We were able to put it on in London for 4 weeks. But it meant we didn't do the Fringe in 2019. And I was still working as a tour guide that year. I mean, I'm still working now as a tour guide, but I get 3 weeks off, very fortunately, to do the Fringe in the summer. But I had 4 or 5 days off within those 3 weeks. I'm 20 minutes away from the city centre.
Yeah.
And to have that on your doorstep, and 20 minutes on the bus, the world's greatest arts festival. Obviously, I like storytelling, I like comedy, but I like the arts. I'll go and see anything. I'll go and see the music. I'll go and see the dance. I'll go and see the circus. And I like going and seeing some of the big names. But obviously, one of the great joys of the Fringe is that you can find a little gem out there, before anybody else has come across them, and see them in a little room with 20 people. And within 5 years, they're going to be a big name. And it's just a very special experience to discover somebody and discover an artist.
Yeah.
So I think that's the joy. You've got the big names. You're fairly sure you're going to have a good time at a certain show.
Sure.
You won't give a chance to other shows.
Every year I take a chance on something just from its description to see what it'll be like. And it could be upstairs in a pub or, wherever it might be.
Yeah.
But what I will say again, just to say to folk, Edinburgh specific shows and during the Fringe are quite rare. So if you're looking for something, this is definitely one to go along to.
Yeah, well, obviously, I would support that view.
You agree with that?
I agree with that. Yes.
Andy, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. Before you go, you should tell people again where and when they can see the show.
Right. Okay. So we're with Greenside Venues, and we are on the 7th of August to the 29th of August. We're off for a couple of Sundays, which I think is the 16th and 23rd, 2 p.m. every day when we're playing, and that's Riddle's Court. So literally just off the Royal Mile, very close to Deacon Brodie's Tavern. You can go and get a drink afterwards. Deacon Brodie's Cafe. You can go and get a coffee before as well. So
Perfect. Completely interactive as well.
there we
Andy,
go.
thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you and all the best with the
Okay.
show.
Yep. Brilliant. Thanks for your time today. Catch you again, Alistair. Thank you.
And I'm delighted to be joined now by writer and actor Brian Dykstra to talk about A Play on Words. First of all, hello, Brian.
Hello.
So tell us all about A Play on Words.
Yeah, Play on Words is a two-character play that examines what's happened to the language in a society where politicians and the like have decided that, well, and social media has decided that language or that meanings of words are fungible, where literally now means figuratively, where we don't answer questions that we're asked, we answer questions that we are prepared to answer. Um, and so the debate becomes whether or not language is actually communication or if it's the opposite. So it's a sort of existential comedy about the failure or the potential success of language to actually communicate.
What inspired that? It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I guess I wrote a play years before where these two lawyers run into this woman who owns a small manufactory, and they're trying to secure her pollution rights for a larger corporation. And these two lawyers hammered her in the opening scene with language that was legalese and double talk in order to throw her off. And the scene lasted about 20 pages before she finally agreed to the deal and left. And then the lawyers dropped back into more human speak. And I just wondered how long a play could go with that kind of, I suppose, tangentialization, if that's a word. Um, how long a play could hold that sort of thing. And I discovered you could write a full-length play.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Before we dig deeper into it, could you let people know where and when people can see it at the Fringe?
Yeah, we're at the front room on George Street. Um, I'm doing two plays back to back there.
Okay.
The other one is called The Problem. I think The Problem is first. I'm gonna give you a general idea. I think The Problem starts around 1:30,
Okay.
and my play starts around 3, a little before 3, at the front room at George Street.
Yeah. Are you acting in them both?
I'm acting in them both. I wrote one. Brian Parks, who is a multiple Fringe First winner, wrote the other one. Um, I loved. I've done Brian's work at Fringe at least 4 times. And so and the other two actors in it are as um, practiced at doing him. He's a very specific playwright, and he needs very specific actors. I'll just say
And,
that about it.
and in terms of a play on words, what can audiences expect when they come into the show?
Well, it's how did we describe? I've been describing it as like an existential comedy that sort of slams up against a vaudevillian who's on first sort. I don't know if Brits know. I guess you
Yeah,
guys
yeah,
must know that. Yeah,
yeah.
sort of who's on first vibe um, that devolves. Well, that exists in a world where politicians have ruined our ability to communicate in a country that's facing its demise, and yet the people who live in that country are not quite aware of it yet. Like America.
Yeah, like that plays well. I mean, what you're talking about in terms of the way that language has. I mean, do you think language is always evolving? We know that, but do you think it has changed recently, partly to social media, which you mentioned, which everybody has a point of view and isn't afraid to kind of say it, but it's such an entrenched point of view that there seems to be discussion is quite rare. It's basically like, this is my viewpoint, and I am in this part, and then you're there, and never the twain shall actually meet.
Yeah, that's actually what the play becomes about. It becomes about the political fragmentation and our confirmation bias. And these two characters are not arguing that. They're actually trying to figure out how to take advantage of that. Uh, and the currency has become fame,
Yeah.
influence, and that leads to success and money. So these are two guys in the Midwest who live in a swing state who are frustrated by politics, and so they're trying to figure out how to get rich so they don't have to care, which I think which I think is what social media helps foster.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I
But
think something else you said, which is really interesting, is people not answering the question they're asked, but just answering the question they want to be asked. Say it this way, and you can see it on political programs every day of the week, where what's the point? What is the point if you're not going to answer what's being put towards you?
Yeah, and it's so rare when someone does.
Mm,
You watch someone get asked a question and then they don't spin it. I mean, maybe it was exactly the question they expected and they wanted, they're prepared, but it's so rare to hear somebody actually answer an actual question in a political forum, or even even I was gonna say, even in a situation like this, like
yeah.
you're on a podcast and you're like, I gotta like quote the show, talk about the show, pitch my show. And I sometimes I get in trouble with producers who are like, just get the information out. And I'm like, well, I'm gonna have a conversation and answer the question instead and see what happens. But yeah, I mean I feel like it's been happening in my lifetime. I remember sort of feeling like maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, you're like, oh, they're not like you see a presidential debate and I think it's slightly different where you guys are that wonderful um parliamentary thing where you all get to shout down the other people if you don't
Yeah.
like the answer. So
Yeah.
you sort of have to be on your front foot and then your back foot and then back to your front foot. In America, we've just been like, there's no debate. They get
Mm,
asked a question and nobody gets to really point counterpoint. They just talk about a non-existent program or a theoretical idea or communism is bad or whatever they want to say. And then the other person responds kind of by what they want to say. And the question almost never matters.
yeah. Yeah. And it's the same over here. We have our
Okay.
weekly Prime Minister's questions, and nobody's really answering what they're supposed to, and they're supposed to be held to account for it. But it's
Yeah.
not really happening. It's not really
Yeah.
happening. Was there some specific thing or event which inspired this for you to write this? Or has it
Yeah,
just been happening over a period?
I don't think so. I think when I was writing a play where they were using language as a weapon or as an obfuscation device, the it sort of naturally became about a debate about language. It doesn't start off that way. I mean, there's a point where somebody pretends to not understand something, and the other character says something along the lines of, listen, you understood what I said because language actually did its job.
Yeah.
It communicated what I was trying to communicate. And the other character's like, that's a pretty naive view of language. And that's how the subject gets introduced. But I wasn't setting out to write a play about the failure of language or the threat of the failure of language. It just sort of, I don't know, form follows function or function followed form in this case or something.
So you mentioned that it's a two-character play. Who are the two characters?
Well, Rusty and Max are played by me. I'm Max, and Rusty is my neighbor who happens by, played by Mark Boyette, who I have worked with many times and love like a brother. Um, Directed by Margaret Perry. So they're just a couple of neighbors who live in a swing state, which is, I don't know, over here that just means one that's in play.
Yeah.
Most of the states in America we know that New York's going to vote Democrat and Tennessee's going to vote Republican.
Sure.
There's no, why bother campaigning there, but there's a handful of states that can go either way, and that seems to be the target of all the political spending to win a couple of undecided voters. And sometimes you feel like, how are there undecided voters? You're, you're either pro-fascism or you're not. But anyway, what do I know?
But it is interesting the way that the political situation similar here. There are certain places where they used to say in Glasgow, where I'm sitting, that there are certain places you could put up, a monkey in the area who was for a certain party, and they would win. That has changed over the years, and now there have been big political shifts with questions of independence and stuff like that. However, there is no doubt that, if you're just focusing on swing seats, as you say, then other people are just not being brought into this conversation at all. You're taking
Right.
that for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm saying, I don't, I mean, indicate we're devolving into a political discussion because that's what the play is. I mean, the
Yeah,
play, that's actually what happens. You don't know it when you're watching it right away. But it becomes this sort of cry in the wilderness that things aren't working and maybe ultimately can't on the path that we're on. And yeah, people get left behind. I mean, the reason why we have who we have as our leader is people are so like I think there's one really good reason to have voted for Donald Trump. If you are actually an anarchist, he is your candidate. If you really want the system to absolutely fall apart, then that's he fine.
yeah.
But I don't think most people are anarchists. But here we are.
Yeah, if you want to embrace chaos, then you maybe get the right man to embrace it. Yeah, definitely. And in terms of coming to Edinburgh, you've been here before. It seems you mentioned you've been here before. Do you enjoy the Fringe? It's a pretty full on time in the city.
Well, I mean, it's almost an addiction after a while. I mean, I warn young people about going to Edinburgh too young because they're gonna,
Lose all their
you know,
money.
well,
Like an addiction. I know exactly what you mean.
well, there's that. But I mean, it's very rare that I don't ever get to sit in a room with, I don't know, three Aboriginal comedians, a drag queen from, Alaska, and some circus performers from Montreal and have a conversation.
Yeah.
You just don't get that very often. Um, and you don't get it very often in Edinburgh, but you get it once in a while. So and there's 4,000, there's 4,000 shows. It's just this
Yeah.
sort of theater camp for adults and then meeting people who are, 22 striking out on their own doing theater, and then some of it's breathtaking.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it's terrible, don't get me wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
but that's just another 15 pounds and 50 minutes of your time and you move on. And so I don't know. It's I've been 9 times. I
Wow.
last year I missed it and I really missed it.
And is there anything you particularly look forward to when you return to Edinburgh? Obviously doing two shows, I'm guessing you don't have that much time to spend.
Well, it's like somebody, was talking about the two shows and they're each about an hour.
Yeah.
So with a 20-minute break in between. So it's almost like just doing a full-length play, like a Carol Churchill play where they're, different. It's only 2 hours and whatever. And then everything, it goes on all day. I mean, we're up until at least 2 in the morning every day. Uh, Luckily, we don't perform until after 1, so we can sleep in the morning. But looking forward to, I don't know. I mean, there are people that you've met over the years that you reconnect with every year. That's always fun. There's the bar time, hanging out and just talking, discussing what you've seen, what you should see, what you shouldn't see. I
Yeah.
mean, I have a friend that comes over to Scout and she comes over in the first week every year and we say, don't come in the second week.
Yeah.
We can we don't have to find the good stuff. We can just tell you the good stuff to go
Yeah,
see.
that's very true. That is very
Yeah.
true. And that's interesting about catching up with people. 'Cause I was talking to a couple of theatre makers from Australia, and they say they meet their fellow theatre makers from Australia much more in Edinburgh than they ever do at home because they're
Yeah.
all kind of descending on this fairly small place.
Yeah. I mean, and the Australian stuff, I know the government really subsidizes and sends over the best of their best. You just can't go wrong going to see a show from Australia, it seems like. I mean, there was something a couple years ago that was very sparsely attended, but man, they were terrific. And 10,000 Hours is a circus show that is happening over there that I was like, look, I love the circus at Edinburgh because you don't see it in America except sort of Cirque du Soleil, and even that's too hard to get into. But that kind of circus tradition that these guys don't have any props.
Yeah.
It's just bodies, and you're just like, wow. It's breathtaking.
Yeah.
Anyway,
These guys I were talking to, they are circus. Circus seems to be big in Australia, and they basically do it with a length of rope. And they're all,
yeah,
that's their prop. It's
yeah.
sensational. Who was your kind of influences in terms of writing for theatre?
Well, the first play I wrote was after I saw a play called Greek by Stephen Burkoff,
Oh wow.
who was in LA. I grew up in LA and did a production of this play, and I was so blown away by the writing. And I mean, the acting was terrific, but the writing just stunned me. So I went home and wrote a pretty mediocre play. Uh, my stuff is compared to uh, Mammoth in the rhythm of it. Sometimes I hear Shepherd, and the guys that were big when I was forming. I loved Tooth of Crime, and I saw Glenn Ross when I was on Broadway originally, and that was pretty great.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, for me though, it's about I give credit to my acting teachers because I understand that playwrights don't have to be actors, but without that sense of like what's truthful or the psychological reality of what's happening in the moment, without being an actor, I don't know how playwrights try on the moments that they're writing.
Right.
I know it's human to be able to access like, oh, that sounds truthful. I'll go with that. Um, so I really sort of credit my acting teachers. I went through a Meisner training in grad school, and that's that repetition stuff, and you just keep drilling down on the truth of the moment, and this play is a Meisner exercise.
Okay.
Now, I don't want that to scare anybody, but these two characters just they they go back and forth, and then somebody makes a misstep, and that gets pounced on, and then reacted to, and volleys are returned. So I really sort of credit my acting teachers for helping me be a playwright.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing play, I have to say. Very much my kind of thing. All the very best with it, Brian. Just remind people before we go where and when they can see you.
This is around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. No, mine's around 3 in the afternoon at George Street, the front room,
Excellent.
every day except one.
And if people are hanging about, they've got some time beforehand, they can see you in the other thing as well.
That's correct. And the problem it starts around 1. I really should have the actual uh, time, but it's around then.
Yeah, and when we put this up on the website, we'll put links to everything so people will know where they can go and get tickets. Listen, it's been lovely meeting you, Brian. All the best. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, you too.
And I'm now delighted to be joined by Andrea Coleman to talk about the show Three Times I Killed. Hello, Andrea.
Hi, Alistair. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. And before we talk about the show, I think listeners would be interested to give a little bit of background about yourself and how you come to be doing this show.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Well, I'm an American, and I was born and raised in Virginia, and I live in New York City now. I've lived in New York for over 20 years, and I started off primarily as an actress and doing like
Right.
Shakespeare, things like that. Um, but then I needed to pay my bills and eat and sleep. So I also went to law school. And so I've been practicing law in New York for, oh gosh, I practiced law for over 17 years and I'm
Right.
still a licensed attorney. But at the same time, I also do stand-up comedy and write plays and solo shows and things like that. So I've been doing both of those things off and on for about 20 years, although the lawyer thing was definitely on the whole time, and then acting intermittently and performing intermittently. So that's a kind of a background. I'm happy to
Yeah.
go into more detail
No, no,
if that's
that's
helpful.
really interesting because I was going to ask you if there are transferable skills between acting and performing and being a lawyer.
I think so. I mean, particularly like reading a room
Yeah.
and getting a sense of the vibe, because on stage, I'm kind of getting a sense of, okay, like how's the audience responding to what's happening right now? Like, what do I need to, what's not coming across, what needs to come across, like what's going on in the room. And that is absolutely necessary and critical as an attorney. Um, because I was a litigator, I was a trial attorney. And so it was like reading, how is the judge feeling? How are the different jurors picking up on things, opposing counsel, their witnesses, like what's happening? What do I need to modify? In particular, I practice mostly in Brooklyn, New York, and
Right.
judges have their favorites. And, you know, like what's the relationship between the opposing attorney that I'm up against and the judge? Sometimes they know each other quite well. Or and sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that works against the other attorney because the judge doesn't like them. So both of those skills in particular, I think are critical as an
Yeah.
attorney and a performer.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So tell us about the show Three Times I Killed. It's an intriguing title.
Yeah. Well, it's about my relationship as like it's about me being a lawyer in court and then how I would get divine communication about what to do and say in court, which certainly is not something I learned in law school. But I had all these wild experiences where kind of, I want to say due to no fault of my own, sometimes I would be thrust into court needing to argue something that I wasn't ready to argue because administrative things happened, and I'd kind of be like, I don't know what to do. And then I'd get divine communication, and I know it was divine communication because it would be things that there's no way that I could know, and that I didn't even know I was allowed to do. So it's kind of it's about that, but then also about identity, because like I was raised a certain way
Hmm.
to be polite and respectful and kind, and congenial. And those are great qualities, but
Hmm.
sometimes those qualities will not help me win a trial. And
Sure.
so sometimes the divine communication would require me to be what my family might call rude or disrespectful, or unladylike. And I kind of had to decide like which one am I going to be. Uh, and I had experiences where I would get divine communication, but it would go against my upbringing and things would not go well. And then I'd have times where I would do things that went against my upbringing, but I would do it and it would be really successful. So it was quite a bit about that. And Killer is the nickname that I got in court from one of
Okay.
my adversaries that I beat a lot. So he gave me that's a little
Wow.
bit of something that you find out in the show, you hear more about, but I'm okay. I feel okay saying that's where the killer comes from. It's me.
And when you heard that you had this nickname, was there a bit of pride about that? Was there kind of, yeah, okay.
I
It
had
sounds like it comes from a
mixed
place of respect.
It came from a place of respect, but I had very mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, I
And
bet.
I didn't like it. Like when I first heard it, I did not like it.
Yeah.
And I talk about that in the show in more detail, but it's certainly not, you know, I was again raised to be ladylike
Mhm.
and sit nicely, wearing my little dress with the little lace on the socks, not to be a killer, but it's very much about like who am I? Like, is this who I really am? Or, because also a stand-up comedian, it's about
Mhm.
kind of like zeroing in and like taking the hit if it presents itself, which
Yeah.
might be uncomfortable for people at times.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to this idea about playing a role, and if you can play the role in inverted commas of killer, maybe it allows you to kind of have less guilt about it.
I think so because I found, at least in my experience in court, my version of killer was quite virtuous.
Yeah.
I never felt like I was called upon to do anything that uh like circumvented the truth. Because luckily I'm a litigator, so most of the decisions were made by a jury. I'm presenting, here are the facts as I see them, and then the jury gets to decide. But um but sometimes when you're calling someone out on their BS,
Yeah.
it it's not going to be, to them it's going to seem mean and rude.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's like, well, I'm doing this in service of my client. I'm doing this in service of the truth, and I'm doing it in service of myself because I'm getting a sense of something and I'm getting like a divine intuitive sense. So I'm like, I know you're full of
Yeah.
crap right now. I'm gonna tell you.
Yeah, which it does it exactly goes against this idea of being polite to say to presumably a fairly stranger person that I don't believe you. So we should let people know when and where they can see you in Edinburgh.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm going to be at Zoo Playground 1, and my show, do you guys say 1400? It's at 2 p.m. every day.
2 p.m. Yep, yep.
So from August 7th through August 30th. So every single day. And I do have a day off, I believe on Tuesday, the 18th.
Yeah, you need a day off, definitely. Have
Yes.
you been to Edinburgh before with a show?
Yes, I had a show last year at the same venue at the exact same time in the
Oh
exact same
wow.
theater. And I had an incredible time. I loved being there, which is why I'm coming back again a year later.
Was this the show of three white guys named John?
Yes.
I'm intrigued by that because at least one of the Johns I'm a massive fan of. So yeah,
Who are you a massive fan of?
the Breakfast
John
Club.
Mayer, John
No,
Bon
no,
Jovi, John Hughes.
John Hughes. The name went out of my head there. John Hughes. Big fan of his movies.
Me
Absolutely.
too. Me too. They shaped me
It
as
shaped
a
me, I
little
think, as
girl.
well, which was really weird being in a high school in Scotland, which was very different to Shermer, Illinois, and and all this kind of stuff. But absolutely, it did. It really did. There was so much that you could still identify with, even though, I mean, it's teenagers, isn't it? That's kind of
Yeah.
universal.
I feel the exact same way. I just felt like, oh my gosh, this guy sees me. And like over so many movies, I was like, I cannot believe it. Like in particular, Uncle Buck,
Yeah,
which is one of my favorites. And like, it's about this whole other thing, like a relationship between a mother and a daughter, which was the relationship that was really compelling to me. And it's so funny. John Hughes is actually, obviously a man, but he had sisters. I think he had like two or three sisters. And so he was obviously watching, I guess, the relationship between his sisters and his mom,
yeah,
because I felt like the depiction of that relationship was so resonant for me and like supportive to me growing up. So, but yeah, so three white guys named John was about how John Hughes, John Mayer, and John Bon Jovi changed my life, and they kind of appeared to me at different moments in my life to inspire me to do the scary thing that I needed to do to
Yeah.
like grow as a person or to like stand up against a bully
Yeah.
and even to quit my job at the law firm so that I could pursue performing full time.
Fantastic. So if it hadn't been for that show, then this current show probably wouldn't have been happening.
Exactly.
Now, going
Yes.
back to Three Times I Killed, what can people expect? What can audiences expect when they come into the theatre?
They can expect a storytelling show that is that is funny. So they can expect some laughs. They can expect to kind of be taken on a ride of like, oh my gosh, I thought this was going to happen, but that's going to happen. And then I think they can expect to walk away feeling inspired. And I'm hoping they walk away feeling willing to trust their own gut, to trust their intuition in their own life.
So you picked the three times that you'd killed, but you said you've been a attorney for a while. Was it difficult to narrow it down to three, or did they present themselves?
They presented themselves very clearly because these were the most significant moments in court when I got communication. Um, it was challenging to shape the stories. And I'll be honest, like I've done a couple workshop performances here in New York, and an attorney who's a friend of mine, or friend of a friend, came to the show and she was like, I can't believe you're being so transparent about some of the things that happen in court. She was like, I would caution against you revealing this much because it doesn't make you look good. Like, I wouldn't tell anybody that you did X, Y, and Z. And I was like, well, that's not what theater is to me.
No, no,
Like
no.
I'm not on stage to just talk about everything I did right and like keeping things like squeaky clean. Like I'm here to tell the truth and to be entertaining. And sometimes I made decisions that I wish I could go back and change, but so you can expect it to be revealing and you can expect it to be a kind of a show where maybe a lawyer in the audience will be like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe she did that. She should not have done that." You know, but it happened.
Did you ever worry about colleagues, it would come back to kind of bite you that you were being so honest about certain things?
I am a little concerned because I do want people to, who knows what the journey will be. I may need to work as an attorney again. I'm
Yeah.
still I'm still licensed, so I'm hoping that I think if I think a real I don't want to say real attorney. I think an experienced attorney knows that early in an attorney's career, they don't always make the same decisions they'd make when they've been practicing for some time. And so
Hmm.
most of these most of the show is about things that happened early in my career. Um, when I was kind of green and definitely really needed some outside intervention and help to know what to do. But I take it with a sense of humor, and I think I have enough wins in my pocket to inspire confidence, but I care more about telling an authentic story and a
Yeah.
compelling story. And so I don't care. I've invited a federal judge here in New York to come see my show, him and his wife. And if he comes, I'm gonna hold my head up high and he's very kind. So I think he will be forgiving. I
Yeah.
would hope. But if not, you know,
No, you got to deal with it, I guess. But then when you're standing in front of him, perhaps with a case, I recognize you from somewhere.
I know.
Well, you should be free of that fear in Edinburgh, that's for sure. That would be incredibly uh, unlucky if someone came along to the show who knew you from there. And I also say I have been in the company of lawyers in the past, and they can be incredibly indiscreet about certain things. Oh yeah, but
Especially when you get a little alcohol in them.
yeah. You know what I'm talking about. Dinner parties and that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so we said this isn't your first time in Edinburgh. Is there something you particularly look forward to going to Edinburgh at this time of year? And we know it's a very busy place.
Well, I have to say, and I hesitate to say this because I don't want it to affect the things I really love, but I'm really looking forward to the food. You all have some incredible restaurants
Edinburgh
in
certainly does.
Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Because like right now I'm plant-based and gluten-free, and so you guys have like so many good restaurants that are plant-based and gluten-free, and even at places where they don't have vegan food, like it's not a vegan restaurant, there are
Yeah.
restaurants with really great options. So I'm really looking forward to the food. I already kind of know which restaurants I'm going back to, and I have a tendency to like go back to the same ones over and over again. So I'm very much looking forward to the food, to be quite honest with you. And then I'm also really looking forward to talking to audience members after the show. Like my show last year, I found that because last year's show was about inspiration. And
Yeah.
so audience members would often stay after and I'd be talking to people for like half an hour or an hour, and they would share with me which of the Johns inspired them and like which movies or which songs. And so it was a lot of like connecting with people and then taking photos with people. So I'm really looking forward to the connections because I I found that like I spend the hour, like I'll be spending the hour talking about my intuition
Mhm.
and the magical things that I've heard and received. So I'm assuming and kind of hoping that people might share those experiences with me. So the food and the people are what I'm really excited to return to.
So you really encourage people after the show to come and seek you out and chat
I
to you.
definitely do. I say to people, I'll be standing in this part of the lobby.
Yeah.
Come on over and like let's like have a hug and a chat and like let's take a photo. And I'm even thinking about bringing some tarot cards with me and doing some like fun, like okay, I'll do a one card tarot pull and like give you a quick little reading if you'd like, because I do have I'm trained as a Reiki master and a shaman in addition to
Right.
being a lawyer. So if time permits, planning to do that too.
So when you talk about divine communication, it can come in a number of ways.
Definitely. Definitely. I think it can come what in my training as in the like Reiki and shamanic training, my teachers have talked about like everybody has gifts and
Yeah.
some are stronger than others, and some people hear things, some people see things, some people feel things. Like I think everybody has that. And so for me in court, it's usually been like hearing something. And I'm like, what? Like what? And so it kind of comes from that for me. But then there also symbols, like you drawing a card and like the card has like pictures or numbers or whatever meanings naturally come in tarot from a certain card.
Yeah.
You see things like symbols of like people have shared that when someone they cared about has passed on, they're like when they see a certain flower or a bird
Mm.
or color, that they know that they're getting like a communication from that person from the other side. So I believe there's so many different ways that people get communications.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Andrea, it sounds like an amazing show. I hope many people come along to see it. Before you go, we should remind people once again where you're on and when.
Absolutely. Okay, it's called Three Times I Killed. It's at Zoo Playground 1 at 2 p.m. It's a
Well,
solo show.
yeah. All the very best with it and all the very best in Edinburgh.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.